All right, grab those Bibles and go to Matthew chapter 6. This is where we'll be today as we continue our series on the Sermon on the Mount. Only thing worse than being snowed in is being snowed in and being on a restrictive diet. Can't eat any comfort food, no chili, no fun soups. We got invited to our neighbors to have breakfast for dinner, and to which my wife replied, "No, we're on a diet." Like, hold up. Maybe you have a different opinion. No. All right, Matthew chapter 6. There was a college student that had been preparing for an exam that he felt unprepared for. It's a difficult test, and he studied maybe not quite as much as he wanted, went in to take the test and realized how difficult the test was as he was taking the examination. So he began to pray repeatedly throughout the test. "God, please help me get this one right." Just praying throughout the exam. At the end of the exam time, the instructor said, "You may now submit your test, but before you turn your test in, I need everybody to sign this sheet of paper that says that you did not request any outside help or receive any outside help for this examination." We have an honesty policy here. This is your accountability. So just as you turn in your test, just sign on this sheet of paper that says, "I did not ask for or receive any outside help." So students went up, turned their test in, signed the paper. This guy held back. He was a little reluctant. Finally, she was like, "Are you hesitant to turn your test in?" He was like, "Yes, to be honest with you, I did seek some outside help. Throughout this test, I've been praying to God to help me during this exam. I feel like that's outside help. I want to be honest. And so what do I need to do here?" She picked up his test, looked through it. She was like, "I think you're good to turn in your paper because God obviously did not hear your prayer." I don't know why what we think about prayer. It can be very intimidating. But in our series, we have been answering this question throughout the series. This is kind of the series question: what does life in the kingdom of God look like? This is kingdom life, and that's what Jesus is teaching us in Matthew 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount, it's often called, is what does life in God's kingdom? In God's kingdom, we've defined as anywhere where the presence of God exists, particularly now in the lives of His people. So this is about life in the kingdom. This is not about how to get into the kingdom. This is not about staying in the kingdom. We've said from week one, you're going to have to tolerate my cough for at least another week. We said from week one that this is about descriptions and not conditions. Describing life in the kingdom and not just what it looks like to get into the kingdom or remain in the kingdom. So this is not a to-do list. If I were to say, what is it like to live in the state of Alabama? You would tell me what it's like to live in the state because you live in the state. It's not what does it look like to live outside the state and trying to get into the state. It's like, no, what is life in Alabama like? You're a part of the state of Alabama. You live in the kingdom of Alabama. We are part of God's kingdom. We live life in the kingdom. Jesus is contrasting true internal righteousness with this external, performance-driven, approval-seeking religious practices of his day that were practiced among the religious. It's interesting that the kind of target audience of Jesus throughout the Sermon on the Mount is the religious. It's not the irreligious. It is the religious. It is people that abided by the rules. They prayed. They fasted. They were givers. They kept the commands that we talked about in chapter 5. These are the people that Jesus is addressing. And yet they did all of these things. They lived by the Bible, if we're putting it in modern terms. They lived by the Bibles, but they did it for all the wrong reasons. And Jesus is taking us deeper He's not asking us to abide by a bunch of rules. He's taking us deeper into what does it mean to have a transformed heart and live as a kingdom citizen. We introduced this section last week in verse 1, where Jesus says, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Righteousness to be seen by others. Jesus warns against practicing good deeds just to be seen by others. So in chapter 5, Jesus said, look, you're abstaining from all these laws, right? He went through these laws. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. There was multiple examples he gave. And he said, look, you've abstained from doing all these things externally, but you've missed what's most important, which is the heart. It's more than not committing murder. It's about the anger that resides in our heart. It's more than not just committing adultery. It's about the lust that resides in our hearts. In chapter 6, Jesus turns his attention to common religious practices like giving to the needy, we saw last week. Fasting, we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. And today, he talks about praying. So public praying was a common practice in Jewish life. It often took place in synagogues or on street corners during very specific designated prayer times. And individuals would often pray to display their own piety. They would pray loud and they would pray with flowery language and often use repetitive formulaic prayers. Jesus refers to the prayers of pagans here or Gentiles, meaning that there were certain formulas that were practiced toward pagan gods to try to compel some type of divine interaction, to try to leverage the gods in your favor, to move God to act in your favor, kind of the genie in a bottle approach to God, to kind of get out of God what you desire from him. But Jesus again shifts the focus from this external religious activity to internal transformation. And Jesus defines prayer as a relational connection with God. A connection that is free from self-promotion and superstition. That prayer flows from the genuine love for God, genuine trust in his provision, rather than a desire for public recognition or even stress over our material needs and wants. Notice Jesus uses the phrase hypocrite again here to critique those who pray publicly for the sake of being seen by others. I told you this word hypocrite is the word that comes from an actor who's wearing a mask or performing on a stage. I feel like I need to cough one time. So, Jesus invites his followers to pray in private, where he focuses on a sincere relationship with the Father and not just outward appearances. So, these verses 5 through 8, kind of serve as a lead-in to the Lord's Prayer, where Jesus will demonstrate how to pray in alignment with God's kingdom. And Jesus invites us to move away from hypocrisy, from public displays of prayer, from attempts to kind of sway God in our favor, and to move toward a sincere, relational, trusting dependence on God. So, there's two common distortions of prayer that Jesus addresses here. And here's what they are. One, hypocritical prayer, and two, mechanical prayer. So hypocritical prayer, that's a tongue twister, is prayer to be performed that gains human admiration, to get approval, to get recognition, for people to say, wow, that must be a spiritual person. Listen to them pray. And then mechanical prayer or repetitive prayer, which is characterized by empty phrases, assuming that some type of repetition, if I say the right words, that will move or compel God to act. So let's go through the text together. Good news about me coughing is you guys get out early. I preached like 20 minutes last week. What? There's coming a day when this is over that I'm going to make up for it. Verse 5, when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. So Jesus speaks to the danger of hypocritical prayer, the goal to gain human recognition. This is street corner praying, Jesus says. You ever been in a big city or a larger city and saw performers, street performers? Maybe they juggle something or a lot of them sing. If you've ever been even to a city like Nashville, it's filled with street performers. And their goal is to get attention, right? To get money in the bucket, to be able to earn a living. If you go to a big city like New York, they're everywhere in the subways and doing all kinds of things. I think we even have a couple around in Decatur on occasion. And being a street performer is different than being a prayer, right? A praying performer. It's one thing to juggle and sing and play an instrument to try to gain attention on the street corner to get a little bit of money. It's another thing to do that praying, trying to get attention and perform about recognition. And Jesus said the reward is the fleeting and temporary applause of humans. That inwardly there's no true heart relational connection with God. And then Jesus contrasts this in verse 6. The opposite of this, what kingdom living is, but when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So the contrast is to seek a private space to ensure that God is your only audience, right? He's your sole audience. So this idea of a room here, this idea of a room is not, how many of you have seen the little Christian movie, I think it's called War Room? Anybody seen that? So in that movie, the lady has like an actual room that she goes into and prays. And some people take that literal and they do that. And if that's a good practice for you, then so be it. But Jesus is not so much talking here about a physical location. That may be helpful. But his idea here is, can I focus intentionally on God? To get out of the spotlight. And the promise is, oh, what is this? Hotty toddy, what? I'm just kidding. I've got like 7 cough drops. Stay tuned. Unbeknownst to most of my crowd, most of the time, 99% of the time I'm preaching, there's a cough drop right here. Did you guys know that? There you go. You have a secret. You now know a secret. So a room is not so much about a physical location. Again, if that's helpful for you, then find a room, use a room. But the idea is intentionally focusing on God. How do I get out of the spotlight and focus my heart on God? And the promise here is that God, the God who sees what is done in secret, will reward. And the reward here is not so much material. The reward is this physical intimacy with the Father himself. That God is the reward. That relationship with God is the reward. So the danger and the contrast of hypocritical prayer. And then Jesus addresses in verse 7 the other, the mechanical, the repetitive prayer. And when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases or babbling, I think is other translations, as the Gentiles do. For they think they will be heard for their many words. They think they will be heard for their many words. I have to admit, on occasion, I've thought that about humans. They think they will be heard because of their many words. Please stop talking. No. This is the danger of empty or repetitive prayer, that people would repeat words or use formulas to try and manipulate God, misunderstanding God's care and his sovereign, intimate nature with his creation. The contrast is verse 8. Instead of doing this, do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you even ask Him. Let me let you in on a little secret. Prayer is not about informing God of anything. It's not to fill God in. It's not to reveal the big secret that God did not know. It's not about informing God. It's not about getting God in our corner. Prayer is about aligning our hearts with Him, with His will, with His kingdom. And this phrase here reminds us of this, that God already knows our deepest needs before we even ask, before we even request, that God already knows our deepest needs. I heard about the little boy that was praying over his Christmas list. And he was praying just kind of through his normal stuff, mom, dad, brother, sister, grandparents, all these things. The grandparents were staying with him at the time, and the mom and dad were in the bedroom with the boy, and the parents noticed that when he started praying for kind of the things he wanted for Christmas, they wanted a bicycle. It was at the top of his list. The parents didn't know if they could afford one, but they had mentioned well, maybe your grandparents, maybe they'll be able to come through and get you a bicycle. So he's praying through his list, and he gets to his Christmas list, and suddenly when he hits the wants, what he wants for Christmas, his volume increases by 10. He's just like yelling to God his Christmas list. I want a bicycle, loud as he can. And the mom replies, son, God is not deaf. What are you doing? And he said, I know God is not deaf, but Mama is. God's sovereign care for His children gives us the confidence to pray to God as a loving Father who listens attentively and cares deeply. True prayer is not about being seen by others. It's not about manipulating God. It's about relationship with the Father. And so we are invited to pray with sincerity and confidence and trust in God's care. So let me give you some just takeaways from Jesus' teaching here for, again, kingdom citizens. What does it mean to live life in the kingdom and to be a praying person? One, there's a challenge kind of built in here for us to examine our motives. Examine our motives when it comes to prayer. Why do I pray? Am I trying to impress others? Am I seeking to alleviate guilt? Am I checking off some religious box? Or am I genuinely seeking God's presence? When I pray, am I drawing attention primarily to myself, my needs, my wants, my desires? Or am I focusing on who God is and connecting with Him as my Father? Or when it comes to manipulative or repetitive prayers here, am I praying to try and win God over? If you're a parent, you know what this looks like. You have a child that just tries to wear you down, right? The initial response was no, and they just go at it, right? What about? How about this situation? Why not? Just on and on and on in an attempt for your no to transition to a yes. Or a would you just leave me alone, right? And so why am I praying to God? Am I trying to wear Him down, to get Him in my corner? Or do I see God as a loving Father who longs to have relationship with His child? Examine your motives. Why am I talking to God? Why am I praying? Here's a second one. It's found within these verses. Practice what the text here describes as private prayer. And again, this doesn't mean you have to isolate yourself or have a prayer closet or some of the lingo that we use. What it does mean is, am I developing relationship with God? Individual, private relationship. I mean, ask yourself, what does it take to build an intimate relationship with another human? I mean, it takes time, right? You have to spend time together. It takes effort. You have to make the effort to get to know someone. It takes communication. You have to talk to the person. You have to be a listener. Like, these are the very basic things of what it means to build relationship with an individual. If I were telling Ashley that I love her and wanted to have a relationship with her, but the only time I ever talked to her was if when we were a crowd of people and I used some flowery language about my wife and told her how awesome she was in front of 50 other people, but I never said that to her directly. That's not the key to how you build relationship, right? That's street performance praying. Or if I told Ashley I wanted to have an intimate relationship with her, but I never talked to her, and I ignored her, or maybe I only came to her when I really needed something and I felt like she could kind of get behind me with, we would not have a healthy relationship at all. We would have an unhealthy relationship and probably no relationship in the end. And yet somehow we kind of think as humans it's different in our relationship with God. The key word here is the word intentionality. Intentionality. Am I setting aside intentional time to be alone and build my relationship with God? Here's a challenging question I asked myself this week. Is most of my prayer life reactive or proactive? Am I reacting to something that's happened in my life? Am I reacting to a need or a want or a desire? Or am I seeking out relationship with God? So what I would encourage each of us, find a place, find a time to turn down the noise and talk to God. A quiet room, walk around the neighborhood, on the drive to work. Turn off the distractions. Put down the phone, turn off the screens, turn off the music, pause the podcast, stop listening to the news. Focus your heart on God and talk to Him. Meditate on His Word. Ask for guidance. Sometimes the most difficult part of practicing private prayer is turning off the rest of the noise to be able to have a moment of silence with Him or communication with Him or talk with Him. We are a culture and a people that need noise in our lives. We're inundated with noise. And so maybe step one for us in a new year and seeking to explore a relationship with God is, how do I be intentional to turn down the noise, turn off the distractions, and build relationship with God? You see, private prayer helps ensure that God is our primary audience. It protects our hearts from pride and our drive for our own recognition and self-promotion. So practice private prayer, whatever that looks like for you. Here's another one, like from this text. Simplify your prayers. Simplify them. How many of you find praying difficult? No one. Well, you guys are a bunch of prayers. Wow. How many of you find praying difficult? How many of you feel inadequate when it comes to praying? How many of you feel intimidated when you hear other people pray? Like, oh my gosh, that person's like got the bat phone to God Himself. People have that praying voice, right? Somehow use King James language when they're praying. How many of you, here's one that probably most of you will raise your hand. How many of you are petrified to pray in public? Just a second, hold your hand up. I'm going to write these names down. The very first full-time church I pastored was kind of old school traditional Baptist. And every time in the service, it was time for the offering. Men would come down with the offering, like the Frisbee offering plates. Remember those things? And it'd stand down here at the aisles and hold the offering plate. And then I would call on one of them to pray over the offering. So it was always like, here's the ones you can call on, here's the ones you can't. There was this one dude named Bobby who was a big farmer, owned a bunch of land in the area. It was a growing area outside of Louisville, Kentucky. And he sold his farm and made a bunch of money just because he sold all that land that he had for subdivisions. And so he had all this money, but he was later in life and he was losing his memory. He was like in the early stages of Alzheimer's or whatever, and he always kind of joking about it. But I'll never forget, I called on him to pray one Sunday. And so Bobby started praying, and he prayed just normal stuff. God, thank you for allowing us to be here today, and thank you for, the many things he prays. And in the middle of the prayer, he does this. And God, I just pray that, lost it. Right in the middle of his prayer. Forgot what he was praying about. Okay, he was at least he was honest about it, right? Oh, lost it. It's like I feel the same way a lot of times, Bobby. Lost it. Praying in public, we're petrified of it. So we're talking about like praying on street corners. Somebody like, I can obey that pretty easy. The text reminds us that God knows us even more deeply than we know ourselves. There is nothing off limits when it comes to talking to our Heavenly Father. As a parent, some of my deepest desires for my children, even as adults, is for them to be open and honest with me and talk to me about their struggles and what they're going through. You're always, like as a parent when they're younger, trying to probe that kind of stuff out of them, right? Something's just kind of a little bit off, like what's going on? Did someone bully you at school? Did you get in trouble? Did something happen? Like you're always trying to probe in to get them to open up. Most kids, like I was when I was a kid, their response is kind of a nothing or everything's fine, right? But as a parent, one of your deepest desires is for your kids to be honest with you and open with you. And I've told my kids, as you probably have as well, I would rather have open, tough conversations about things or decisions that maybe you've made that I may disagree with. But I would rather have an open policy for you to be able to come and talk about those things with me than to feel like you need to keep those things to yourself. I am so thankful that as a Heavenly Father who loves us, text says how much more than we love our kids. That God is not looking for flowery. He's not looking for fake. He's looking for sincere and authentic. He's looking for quality over quantity. And that God knows the deepest hurts, wants, desires, needs of our hearts even more than we know them ourselves. And He invites us to come to bring those things to Him. So simplify your prayers. It's not about getting it right. It's not about getting the right words. Step one, if you're praying, that's a win. Starting the conversation is a win. So simplify your prayers. Bring those things to God. How about this one? Trust God's care and compassion. It's easy to stand on the stage and say, hey, God knows you better than you know yourself. But do we truly believe that God knows our deepest needs and cares? Two different things. Do we really believe that God knows it all? And not only that He knows it all, but one, He still loves us completely, and He cares for our needs. Trust that God cares. Trust His compassion. Do we feel anxious and attempt to control our life situations and just try to kind of sway God in our corner through prayer? One thing I've learned in my own life, and that even you hear a lot of people say when it comes to prayer, if you will learn to begin your prayers, your conversations with God with gratitude and thanksgiving, and release your worries and anxieties to Him by starting with gratitude, thanksgiving, recognition of who He is. I learned something recently I thought was pretty fascinating, and I learned it in the life context of I have a couple of kids that have struggled with anxiety and feelings of stress in their life. Pretty overwhelming at times. And so that, as a parent, makes you kind of dig into anxiety and things like that, and what are some healthy ways to deal with anxiety. Not just, treat it with medication, even though that's necessary a lot, but also what are some healthy, emotional, spiritual, mental ways to deal with it. And I learned something just the last few weeks. Did you know that the same part of your brain that triggers anxiety also triggers gratitude? Same part of your brain, which makes Paul's words fascinating in the book of Philippians when he says, do not be anxious about anything, but put your mind on who God is. So 2,000 years ago, Paul was spitting that up. So the same part of your brain that triggers anxiety also triggers gratitude. And so kind of a common practical way to begin to deal, and again, look, this is layered. I'm not talking about there's times that you need to be on medication and things to help deal with those things to help you be healthy. But a practical way is when you are beginning to feel anxious or nervous or stressed, to begin to express gratitude or thankfulness. And so maybe when that anxiety starts to come on, that you sit with a piece of paper and begin to write down all the things that you are thankful for, that you have gratitude for. And look, that's not a cure-all. It's not a pray and it goes away solution. But it is a very practical way to say, how do I focus my mind on God in my most extreme moments of worry and anxiety and fear and uncertainty? Because it is physically, humanly impossible to focus both on anxiety and on gratitude at the same time. It's not how our brains are wired. Trust God's care and compassion. Good news. God knows. God sees. God cares. God can be trusted. Here's our last one. Pray with a kingdom perspective. Are my prayers more focused on me or on Him? Are my prayers more focused on me or on others? Are my prayers more focused on me or the advancement of God's kingdom? Jesus provides us an example of praying with a kingdom perspective. We'll dive into it next week. Let's just read it this morning. Verse 9. Pray like this. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we have also forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. We'll break down this famous prayer, the Lord's Prayer, next week. But if you notice, this prayer focuses on worshiping God for who He is, aligning our hearts with God's will, based on those things, who He is, aligning our hearts, asking for our daily needs, requesting forgiveness and strength. Like, that's pretty simple praying, isn't it? Recognizing God for who He is, asking God to align my heart with His desire for me, asking for my daily needs, and then for forgiveness and strength built into that. You see, prayer is not about what I can get from God or recognition from others. Prayer is formative. It is about what God is doing in me, His transformational work in me. Prayer is about relationship. Now, let me end with this gospel thought. When Jesus was on earth, He prayed. He prayed. He went away to solitude places. Prayed. The Son of God on earth prayed. That says something to us, right? That if He was dependent and trusting in the Father while on earth, how much more should we be cultivating relationship with Him? But I don't want to leave it at that, because here's what the rest of that story is. Not only when Jesus was on earth did He pray, but right now, Jesus is praying on our behalf. The biblical word for that is the word intercession. Intercession. The word intercession is the present activity of Jesus, the present action of Jesus that pulls at God's rescue story, the redemptive story, from both ends. Here's what that means. The present action of Jesus is based on what has already been accomplished, what He's already done. That salvation has been won, that it is finished. And so Jesus is interceding on our behalf based on what He has already done for us, that the victory has already been declared. He is also interceding from the end of the redemption story, from the glory that awaits us in the future, what he is doing now and what he will do in the future. And so he is interceding on our behalf based on what he has already accomplished for us on the cross and based on what God is accomplishing in our lives and will accomplish in the end of all of this thing. Intercession. In other words, Jesus is applying the finished work of the cross on you. He's interceding on your behalf. That means he is lavishing you in the Father's love. That means that he is assuring you of your forgiveness. That means that he is healing your wounds. That means that he is breathing courage into your lungs. That means he is speaking life into your soul. That's what intercession is. And that's what Jesus is doing on your behalf. He is praying for you. And it is based on his eager desire to provide mercy and grace for us in our time of need. As we saw during our couple of Christmas weeks when we looked at Hebrews 4. So that we may approach his throne in confidence and trust. Jesus made God accessible. And what we discover when we pray is a loving Father who longs to know and love and forgive and heal and strengthen and provide and care for us. So go to him. Talk to him. He is our Father. And that's what it means to live life in his kingdom. Let's bow our heads for prayer.